The religious have no grasp on reality and they don't want one because reality isn't emotionally comforting. We've known that forever, but they insist on proving it time and time again. So here we go again, down the stupidity rabbit hole, because the religious want nothing at all to do with the truth. They wouldn't know what the truth was if it bit them in the ass. So here we go again. Hey, let's do some Tim Barnett. Haven't done that for a while, right? He's asking a good question. Are religious people just dumb? But he can't accept the answer because there goes his income if he does. But he clearly doesn't understand what the hell he's talking about, as if that's any surprise, and that's where he's going to go completely wrong. So let's go take a look at Tim making a complete fool of himself. You know, in other words, just another Thursday.
Please don't cancel me, but I think religious people are a little dumb.
I think they're really dumb. And no, that's not really intended as an insult. It's just the way that it is. Because according to the dictionary, dumb just means stupid. And I know that's just running around in circles because if you look up stupid, it says dumb. I get it. It's hard to get a solid independent definition, but if we look at phrases like dumb down, which is really what religion does, it means to simplify or reduce the intellectual content of something so as to make it accessible to a larger number of people. And this is exactly what religion does. It makes complex subjects absurdly simple so that people with very little cognitive function can deal with it emotionally. So when I say that these people are dumb, that is exactly what I mean. And yes, that is exactly what's going on.
And that they're lacking some brain cells.
I don't think that's necessarily true. I will see people saying that the religious are brain damaged or whatever, and that is simply not the case. There's nothing really wrong with their physical brains, at least no more than any other group of people. They are just so desperate to believe things for which there is no evidence to support it because it makes them feel all warm and tingly inside. So I'm not saying that these people are mentally ill necessarily, although certainly there are some that are. Religious delusions, hyper-religiosity, and religious OCD, they're certainly real things. I don't think that they are religious because they're mentally ill. I think that their mental illnesses are given form because they are religious. However, that's really neither here nor there. The real religious wingnuts don't have an excuse because they're out of their minds necessarily. They are out of their rational minds by choice, and that is not a good thing.
And I don't want to think like that. That's the thing. I'm trying to better myself.
I totally understand wanting to better yourself, but insulting other people isn't a good place to start.
If what you're saying about them is accurate, then sure it is. We seriously need to stop rejecting reality and substituting our own because you're afraid of offending someone else. The truth is the truth is the truth, and only the truth matters. In fact, pointing out what's wrong with others, assuming there is really something wrong with them, is probably the first step in them getting the help that they need. That's something that the religious don't want to talk about, isn't it? Now, I see a lot of theists trying to play tone police around here, and no, that's never ever going to work because I care a lot more about reality than I do about your fifis and faith. I don't care what makes you happy. I care what harm you are causing to society with your asinine beliefs. And yes, you are causing harm, not like the religious tend to care. And that's kind of pathetic, isn't it?
Self-improvement doesn't require putting others down.
Don't take this as I'm dogging on religious people. I'm not. I'm trying to be a better person.
Now, I have no idea who this is, and honestly, I don't really care. I am trying to make reality a better place to be, and that means making humans smarter and more rational, and sadly, the religious don't want to do that, do they? Because nothing I'm doing here is designed to make me feel good or make me happy, whereas the religious are only concerned with that, right? It's all emotional comfort and never having the best understanding of factual reality that you can. Because reality isn't going away no matter how much you close your eyes and wish. Learn to deal. Otherwise, you're just making yourself look like an idiot and proving that that's exactly what you are.
You just called us dumb and brain cell deficient.
Well, the first one is absolutely accurate. I don't accept the second, but the first? Damn straight. Because you are not operating in an intelligent manner. You are running on feelings, not facts. In fact, you are terrified of the facts. We see that all the time. We can point out to them where they are factually wrong, and they don't care one bit. Because fifis. Because that is a ridiculously poor way to live your life. But they don't care, do they? They just really want to believe. But that is never going to be good enough.
How else should we take that?
It's just like, weren't we in the same science class?
Unfortunately, no. For a lot of theists, they're being homeschooled by ignorant parents or put in religious schools where they're pushing feelings over facts. Even for the ones that do go to the same schools that you did, they are being brainwashed behind the scenes into ignoring and rejecting the best supported scientific findings that we have, because they don't care about that. This is the problem, or at least one of them, where they are trying to force reality into an emotionally comforting shape instead of just dealing with reality as it actually is. These are people who have never actually matured into realistic, rational adults. And that's why they're dumb.
Like, didn't you guys learn about the Big Bang Theory at the same time I did? I'm not getting it.
And neither are they. They don't want it to be true because their big book of multiple choice says it isn't true. Or at least that's how some of them interpret it. Yet, you don't get to reinterpret reality into a form that you like. It is what it is. You have to learn to deal. You really don't have a choice because your feelings don't matter. You have to grow the hell up and deal with the facts as they are, and the facts are not what you find in a silly book of mythology. This is why they're dumb. Instead of starting with the evidence and following it where it leads, they start with a conclusion that they really like for emotional reasons and then pretend that matters. And I'm sorry, it does not. Your feelings mean nothing. Only the facts do, and the religious, they are positively terrified of the facts, aren't they? And again, that's why they're so dumb.
Yeah, I was in that science class. In fact, I liked it so much I got a degree in physics and taught about the Big Bang in that science class. And fun fact, the Big Bang Theory was actually proposed by a physicist who was also a Catholic priest, George Lemaitre.
Even more fun fact, he didn't use his religious beliefs to come up with it. And when the Pope wanted to use God as a justification, he told the Pope not to do that because if science made further discoveries that invalidated the finding or altered it significantly, it would make God look bad. Because people who are religious can certainly do science, but the science that they do has nothing at all to do with any gods. It has to do with examining the real world. God is a mere afterthought at best, a bald rationalization at worst. There is no evidence that any gods actually exist at all. Not that the religious care because, they just really want to believe. That doesn't make any of it true, though. So stop being a dipshit. There are way more ignorant theists than there are scientific theists. In fact, lots of theists are desperately trying to explain why science doesn't work, even though it demonstrably does, because these people just really don't want it to be true. Yeah, these people are out of their minds.
Moreover, the Big Bang describes a universe which came into being a finite time ago.
No, not really. So clearly, your degree in physics sucks. Yes, our particular instantiation of space-time came about a finite amount of time ago. That doesn't mean everything that could ever exist anywhere did so, because we also know that's not true. And that doesn't help when you've got a bunch of young earth creationists running around embarrassing your religion. Granted, I don't think he's one of them. At least I don't remember if he is, and I couldn't find a specific answer. But Tim certainly doesn't criticize creationism, no matter how dumb it is, because he's really after money and not fact. That's not exactly a surprise either, is it? Remember, he's still part of the scam that is Stands Against Reason. Ken Ham, writing on the Answers in Genesis website, says that Stands Against Reason doesn't believe in evolution, but that doesn't make them a creationist group. No, it just makes them idiots. What else is new?
This is totally compatible with a creator. After all, a Big Bang needs a Big Banger. So contrary to popular belief, science and faith aren't enemies.
They're certainly not friends, though. However, just believing stuff because you really like the idea, that doesn't make you rational, and that's fundamental to science. Unfortunately, the religious are willing to rationalize their way back to their beliefs instead of caring if their beliefs are actually true. The answer to any question for which you have no evidence is not, God done it. It's, I don't know, and that's where they go wrong. You have to care about the actual state of reality, not the thing that you really wish was true. This is where they're going wrong, and this is why Tim is a moron. He doesn't know how to think critically.
In fact, many of history's greatest scientists, like Sir Isaac Newton, Johannes Kepler, Francis Bacon, James Clerk Maxwell, Louis Pasteur, and Gregor Mendel, were deeply religious people.
Because they didn't have a choice. Back then, if you wanted to be part of society, you had to at least pretend to be religious. Otherwise, you'd get shunned, or worse, possibly killed, because the overwhelming majority of religious society wouldn't accept you. This is not the slam dunk that you seem to think that it is. In fact, it just makes you look dumb for even suggesting it. This, too, is a problem that the religious tend to have. And don't think this applies only to the religious, because it really doesn't. I'm just focusing on them because that's what the video is about. Rational people look for actual answers regardless of how it makes them feel. The actual answer for why people in the past were so religious is that they had to be, or at least pretend to be, otherwise they would have been penalized for daring not to be. So stop being a moron, Tim. It's really not a good look.
That's hardly a list of people who were lacking brain cells.
And then, like, critical thinking emphasizes skepticism and the need for evidence, and faith ignores that. And I don't get it. I don't like it.
And she's right. Critical thinking wants actual answers, not made up, emotionally comforting ones. Granted, Tim is going to rationalize his way around it because he's a scam artist trying to con the gullible, but it remains a fact nonetheless. Critical thinking and skepticism are essential to science, and the religious lack those to any significant degree. They just want it to be true. They favor fifis over facts, often to the complete exclusion of facts because they can't handle dealing with the real world as it demonstrably is. But here comes Tim's bald rationalizations because he doesn't want to look stupid, even though he is. So he just makes up bullshit because that'll work for the religiously deluded. Sad but true.
So,
Actually, biblical faith doesn't ignore the evidence, it includes the evidence.
Bullshit. You wouldn't know what evidence was if it bit you in the ass. This is the problem that we see all the time, right? It sounds good to me doesn't make it evidence. It gets me where I want to go. That doesn't make it evidence either. Evidence is that which you can present to others that demonstrably fits the objective facts. That's not what's in the Bible. You don't have any evidence for the supernatural because there's no evidence that the supernatural exists. You just really like the idea, and that means jack squat. This is, again, why you don't start with the conclusion that you like for emotional reasons. You start with the evidence that you have, and you see where it takes you, no matter where that happens to be. Rational people don't start out with a goal in mind. The religious do. So, you're full of shit, Tim. Stop being an idiot.
It's trusting in what you have good reason to believe is true.
And what are those good reasons? Feelings, wishes, and dreams? Or do you have objectively verifiable evidence that is actually demonstrably true? Because we all know the answer to that, and it's not yes. The Bible isn't a valid source of information until you can independently and objectively prove that it is. And you can't do that. You're not even trying. That's why rationality isn't emotional. It seeks out true answers backed up by objective, verifiable evidence, no matter what it is. I don't care where I wind up, so long as I follow the evidence to the most rationally demonstrable end that I can. And even then, I don't cling on to that because I could have done it wrong. Or we could find new evidence in the future, and when it does, I'm going to have to go looking again to see if it leads somewhere else. It doesn't matter how attached I might be to something, it's either true or it's not true, and how I feel about it doesn't mean a damn thing. That's why the religious are wrong so often, because they care only about their own feelings. They don't care at all about the facts.
Jesus didn't say, just believe me because I say so. He said, even if you don't believe me, believe the works, the miracles, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me. John 10:38.
And you have no independent evidence that there even was a Jesus, or that said Jesus ever said that, or that there were ever any miracles. Just because you really want it to be true, that doesn't make it true. This is argument by assertion, not by evidence. You cannot prove that any of the crap in your silly book, at least the supernatural stuff, ever happened at all. Your feelings don't mean anything. The evidence does, and you don't happen to have any of that, do you? I wouldn't say if you did, but it always comes down to faith. And the second that faith enters the equation, the whole argument fails.
In other words, look at the evidence. He didn't ask for blind faith. He gave people reason to trust him.
Which does us no good right now because you can't prove that any of it ever happened that way. You just have to believe it. And I'm sorry, but until you can support it evidentially, I have no reason whatsoever to take any of what you say seriously. This again is why the religious are so dumb, because their epistemic standards suck. They're not based in anything demonstrable. They just really want to believe. But that doesn't mean anything. In order for any of that to be true, you'd have to prove that Jesus ever existed. And good luck on that, because we already know the evidence doesn't support you. My book says a thing doesn't matter. Then you'd have to prove that he ever did a single miracle. What you think doesn't matter. What you believe is irrelevant. What you can prove does. Let us know when you've achieved that, because we'll be waiting for a very, very, very long time. This is why the religious are so unimpressive, because they don't actually care about the truth. They care about their childish fifis, and that makes them stupid. It just does.
So faith is trust, but trust in something or someone that's trustworthy.
And you have none of that, at least not demonstrably, because you can't even prove any of this stuff is real. Just saying, I think Bigfoot is trustworthy, doesn't make Bigfoot real. That's where you have to have evidence to back it up, and we all know you've got nothing. If you did, then you certainly would have trotted it out by now. Saying that you trust someone doesn't mean that you should. Lots of people trust scam artists. That's kind of required for them to make any money, isn't it? That doesn't mean that they should be trusted. In fact, they definitely shouldn't be, which makes his entire point invalid. It's all just, well, it sounds good to me, but that's really stupid, isn't it? How did you get there intelligently? Where is the evidence that you used in support while you got there? And they don't have an answer to that.
That's why the Apostle Paul says, test everything and hold fast to what is good. Christians are called to love God with all their minds. That involves critical thinking.
You serious?
It does nothing remotely of the sort. But you notice that all he can do is quote a silly book without ever having examined its claims intellectually, right? Because they don't care. Now, it just so happens that as I was writing this on Memorial Day, for anyone interested, one of those JCO videos went live on the channel and I watched it. They're all still doing the same thing, aren't they? They all take this crap on faith. It has to be true because fifis. And anyone who doesn't automatically believe them, well, they have to be in the wrong because, hey, the religious can't be, right? Even if they are, they can't be wrong because that would hurt their feelings and they can't have that. But here's the reality, and it's something that they don't want to hear. It doesn't matter what you want to be true. It matters only what you can prove is true, and they can't prove shit. That's why we do not believe them. That's why we are not convinced, because their claims are utter crap, unsupportable in any rationally defensible way, with no evidence at all that they can present. They're just really like the idea. Fuck them.
And then also, aren't there like thousands of different religions?
Yep, there's lots of options.
And no evidence for any of them. It's just different groups of people who really want to believe. That doesn't make any of it true. Yet it's the truth that matters, right? So how do we tell the difference between the various religions and their singularly unsupported claims? Hell, how do we tell the difference between the 45,000 distinct sects of Christianity? None of them can prove that their beliefs or their interpretations are true. They just all have to start with blind faith and go from there, and that simply isn't convincing. We don't care what you want to be true. We care what you can prove to be true. And you can't prove anything except that you're all delusional and irrational. And that is not a good thing. Knock it off.
That's why we need critical thinking, to compare them and ask if any matches with reality.
Sadly, no religion ever does. But he wouldn't be willing to rationally evaluate any of those problem spots because Tim is an idiot. Because nowhere in demonstrable reality are there any verifiable gods or the supernatural or anything like that. And where you have no evidence, you should have no belief. If you have belief without evidence, you're no longer doing critical thinking. That's kind of a problem for your side. Because there is no faith in critical thinking. There is only demonstrable fact. There is only verifiable evidence. Where demonstrable fact is lacking, you don't just get to say, God done it. You can only say, we don't know, and keep looking. That's not what the religious are doing, is it? And I wonder why not.
So just because there are many religions doesn't mean that none of them are right.
But it also doesn't mean that all of them aren't wrong. The only ones that could possibly be right are the ones that match all the data that we have, and so far as I know, none of them do. In fact, every single religion I've ever encountered makes unsupportable claims, based on no verifiable fact, because they really want it to be true. But that doesn't make it true. So he's really not proving that religious people aren't dumb. In fact, I think he's just justifying it, because smart people just deal with the facts better than this and don't feel the need to make shit up because it makes them happy. And that's really all the religious are doing, right?
It just means we have to do some investigation.
It seems a little daft to think that to know that yours is the correct one and discredit all the others.
If you're going to be rational, yes, because you shouldn't even have a worldview that isn't evidentially supportable. So why do you? Because I certainly don't, except for the problem of heart solipsism, where you don't really have a choice. But my view of the world is based on evidence and nothing but. If there is no evidence, I do not believe. I take no positive position whatsoever. I don't know. It's the people who are doing this emotionally, people like, you, that are having all the problems. Because you're an idiot. Knock it off.
Wait a minute. You just said it's daft for a person to believe their worldview is correct and to discredit the others. But isn't that exactly what you're doing to religious people in your video? You believe you're right and religious people are wrong.
Because religious people have no actual data to back them up. Now, I can't speak to the person in the video because, not me or anything, but the religious are wrong, and demonstrably so, because they have no evidence to back up their unsupported claims. Nobody cares what makes you feel good. We care what is actually true. If you don't, then your epistemology is shit. Stop it. Seek help.
And how'd you put it?
I think religious people are a little dumb.
I do too, and demonstrably so, because they believe things for which they can offer no corroboratory support. Because anyone who believes a thing but can't back it up, they are being stupid. That's not just the religious. I mean, flat earthers are morons. Alien abduction fanboys are idiots. Conspiracy theorists, by and large, since that's a very large topic, they're all imbeciles. I'm not picking on only the religious. I'm picking on their piss-poor philosophy because what they believe is intellectually indefensible. And that's stupid.
And that they're lacking some brain cells.
In fact, your video is attempting to discredit religious belief as anti-science and anti-critical thinking.
Which, by and large, it does. Because believing in an imaginary father figure in the sky for which you have absolutely no corroboratory evidence is anti-science. It is a violation of critical thinking. What the hell are you rambling on about, Tim? The very fact that you have the beliefs that you do proves how wrong you are. It proves just how irrational you are. Because let's look at what that word means, shall we? Irrational is not being logical or reasonable. I mean, that's you. It's not reasonable or logical to believe things without corroboratory evidence. That's childish, and that is exactly what you're doing. Now, does that make a lot of people irrational? Damn straight it does. So what? Just saying they're stupid too doesn't give you a license to play along. This is where you've got the problems. Knock it off!
Ironically, if we apply a little critical thinking, we can see that you're doing the very thing that you're calling daft. But I don't fault you for making this video. You think you're right and religious people are wrong. Fair enough.
But it doesn't matter what anyone thinks. It matters what people can prove. The religious have a burden of proof because they're the ones making all the claims. They have not met that burden of proof. Therefore, it is entirely fine to call them out on it because they haven't proven themselves to be right. Just believing because you wanna doesn't mean anything. It means that your epistemic standards are crap, and that's on you. Fix it already, but you can't and you don't want to because you are emotionally attached to these irrational beliefs. If you had a brain in your head, you'd reject them until you had sufficient demonstrable evidence that they were actually true. And you don't have that. You're just an idiot. Rent a clue.
Truth by nature is exclusive.
No, it's demonstrable. That's the whole point. You can't declare it true until you can show how you have rationally come to that conclusion with evidence in support. Why don't you give that a shot? Because that would sure be nice. But we ask you questions, you have no credible answers, and then you just whine, well, it's not my problem, it's yours. No, you are wrong. It is your problem because you are believing things that you cannot objectively back up. You need to be able to do that. Otherwise, we are completely justified in calling you out on your idiotic bullshit. And that's what we're doing. Learn to deal. Get better because you're sure not impressing anyone with a brain. You're just making yourself look dumb.
For example, if the Big Bang Theory is right, then the theories that contradict it are wrong.
And since the Big Bang is clearly supported by all the evidence that we currently have, it is one of the best supported ideas in all of cosmology. What about your God belief? It's not supported by anything but your own wishes and dreams. This is what you want to be true, but that doesn't make it true. That's why we always have to go back to the evidence, even for things that we've already established, because we're constantly learning new things. Our ideas change as new data becomes available. However, the new data has only increased our confidence in science, while it's made the silly religious beliefs that you cling to look more and more idiotic, because you don't have anything. Seriously, stop being a moron.
In a similar way, if Christianity is right, then the religions that contradict it are wrong.
Yes, but since no religion out there has any evidence whatsoever for its own validity, so what? You have to prove that you're right first, and you're not even trying. You're just asserting it without any demonstrable evidence whatsoever. That is not how this works. You don't just get to declare, I like this one the best, and expect that to impress anyone, because you're going to be very, very disappointed if that's what you expect.
Same if Islam's true, or atheism. So the better question isn't how many religions are out there, but which actually makes the most sense of the world.
And the answer is none of them. Seriously, that's why we look at the data and not your childish fee-fees. It doesn't matter what you want to be true. It matters what we can prove actually is. And where we are lacking enough evidence to make a rational call, the answer is, we don't know, and we do not believe. You are on the wrong side of this, no matter how you look at it, because you are not behaving critically. You are not dealing with things rationally. You are just going through the bullshit in your head because you really like the idea. But that is not how rational evaluation works. You don't get a double standard just because you really like it. One standard is all we need, and it's not yours, because yours is clearly stupid.
And that's a question worth thinking critically about.
It doesn't make sense to me. I don't get it. Can you help?
I mean this with all sincerity. I really hope that this video helps.
Oh, it helped all right. It helped us to see clearly that you're just an irrational moron. That is not really a surprise because it's been obvious for years. Now, I don't necessarily agree with how she put things, especially that whole cancel thing, because that's really dumb. But she is right that the religious have no rational justification for the things that they believe, and they need to. Tim is just a con man lying for the Lord because it helps make him money and gain influence. That has nothing at all to do with truth. But Tim clearly doesn't care about the truth, does he? He just really wants to believe, and he really wants other people to give him money for doing so. Where is his video presenting the demonstrable, testable, verifiable evidence that his imaginary friend exists? Funny, I don't remember seeing that anywhere on his channel, do you? Nor on the channels of any other apologist, because it simply doesn't exist. That's what you need, and you can't do it. So your beliefs are irrational, and you need to knock it off. Welcome to the real world. But people like Tim are terrified of the real world, aren't they? They'd much rather say, well, it sounds good to me, instead of putting their beliefs to the actual rational test, because they know that they're going to fail miserably, because they always do. That's why he's not talking to us. He's not on a stage with a bunch of atheists hashing this out. He's in his religious safe space, spewing theological garbage to people who already believe it for entirely emotional reasons, because he can't do otherwise without looking like a fool. Well, newsflash for you, fucker. You already do. Anyone with a brain looks at him and laughs. But he doesn't care about us because we don't give him money. That's the scam. Always has been and always will be. And that's kind of sad, isn't it?